15 years after a school janitor secretly repaired a poor girl's broken violin, she came back looking for him. What she found changed both of their lives forever. Rain had been falling over Millbrook since morning, turning the windows of Harrison Middle School silver. Long after most students had gone home, 11-year-old Emily Carter remained in the music hallway with an old violin case resting across her knees. Emily wore an oversized navy coat that had belonged to her cousin. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and there was never enough money for private lessons or an instrument of her own. The violin inside the case belonged to the school. The next morning, Emily was supposed to audition for a scholarship offering lessons, a youth orchestra position, and a summer music program. For the other students, it was an opportunity. For Emily, it felt like the only door to her future. Her father had recognized her love of music before anyone else. Before he died, he played classical records during Sunday breakfast and promised that one day people would sit in silence simply to hear his daughter play. That afternoon, another student had rushed around a corner and struck Emily's music stand. The violin slipped from her hands and hit the floor. Its bridge snapped, one string broke, and a long fracture appeared beside the tailpiece. The music teacher examined the damage with a heavy expression. The school had no replacement instruments, and a professional repair would take several days. The audition rules required every student to perform at the scheduled time. Emily carried the broken violin into the empty hallway. She touched the damaged wood and whispered an apology, as though the instrument were alive and she had failed to protect the last chance her father believed she deserved. She did not notice George Miller standing near the corner. At 67, George had worked as the school's janitor for 12 years. Students knew him as the quiet man who polished floors and repaired doors, but almost nobody knew his story. George had often heard Emily practicing after school. Sometimes he stopped outside the music room and listened. Her technique was still developing, but she played with an honesty that reminded him of a life he had tried to forget. Long before becoming a janitor, George had worked beside his father in a small instrument repair shop. He had learned to reset bridges, mend cracks, shape wood, and restore violins that other people believed were beyond saving. George had also been a violinist, but when his wife became ill, he sold the shop to pay her medical bills. After she died, he placed his own violin inside a closet and never played it again. He approached Emily and asked what had happened. Embarrassed by her tears, she explained the accident and admitted that her mother could not afford the repair. George sat beside her and asked permission to examine the instrument. His rough hands moved carefully over the cracked wood, loose string, and broken bridge. Emily asked whether it could be fixed. George told her that most broken things could be repaired if someone still believed they were worth saving. When Emily said the audition began at 9 the next morning, George quietly closed the case. He told her to catch the bus home and return at 7:30. Then he took the violin and pushed his cleaning cart away. After the last teacher left, George carried the case into the maintenance room. He cleared a workbench beneath the brightest lamp, covered it with an old cloth, and opened a locked metal box he had not touched in years. Inside were fine carving tools, clamps, files, and pieces of maple saved from his father's shop. At the bottom lay a faded photograph of young George holding a restored violin while his wife smiled beside him. George began by cleaning the fracture and aligning the grain. Too much glue would deaden the violin's voice, while too much pressure could widen the crack. His hands were older now, but they remembered every careful movement. The broken bridge could not be saved. George selected a piece of maple, traced the shape, and carved a replacement by hand. Outside, rain struck the windows while the entire school disappeared into darkness. Hours passed. George's back ached and his fingers stiffened, yet the work awakened something grief had buried. He adjusted the bridge, replaced the string, checked every seam, and polished the worn instrument until the wood glowed. Shortly before 3 in the morning, George raised the violin beneath his chin. The first note sounded weak, so he adjusted the bridge once more. The next note filled the small room with a warm and trembling voice. George closed his eyes. For a moment he was back in his father's shop, and his wife was waiting by the window. A tear crossed his cheek as music returned to hands that had remained silent for more than 20 years. Before closing the case, George wrote a message on a small piece of paper. An instrument does not have to be new to make something beautiful, he wrote. Neither does a dream. He left the note and signed. Emily arrived early the next morning and found the violin waiting on the hallway bench. The crack was nearly invisible. A new bridge stood beneath fresh strings, and the instrument looked more beautiful than she had ever seen it. When Emily played the first note, its voice sounded richer than before. She asked George how he had learned to repair it, but he only said that long ago someone had been kind enough to teach him. At 9 o'clock, Emily walked onto the auditorium stage. 3 judges waited behind a table. Her hands trembled until she noticed George standing quietly in the shadows near the rear doors. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. Emily began to play. She thought about her father, her exhausted mother, the broken instrument, and the janitor who had worked through the night for a child he barely knew. By the final passage, her fear had become music. The final note faded through the auditorium. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one judge lowered her pen and began to applaud. Emily won the scholarship and became the youngest member of the regional youth orchestra. Before Emily left for the summer program, she tried to thank George with a gift. He refused. Instead, he told her that if success ever carried her somewhere beautiful, she should leave a door open behind her. The scholarship led to another scholarship. Emily studied at a respected conservatory and performed in cities she had once seen only in books. Audiences praised her technique, but they remembered the compassion underneath every note. Emily kept George's message inside her violin case. In London, Boston, Vienna, and Paris, she read it before walking on stage. Every performance reminded her that her career had survived because an overlooked man believed her dream was worth saving. 15 years passed. George retired from Harrison Middle School with a small pension. Rising medical costs consumed most of it, and when his apartment building was sold, the new owner announced a rent George could no longer afford. George packed his belongings into cardboard boxes without telling anyone. There were only a few shirts, some books, photographs of his wife, the old tools from his father's shop, and a violin that had remained untouched for decades. That same winter, Emily returned to Millbrook for a charity concert. She visited her old school and asked for George. The new principal explained that he had retired 3 years earlier and had not contacted the school recently. Emily searched through old records until she found an address. Snow had begun to fall when she arrived and saw George carrying boxes toward an aging truck. He looked smaller and more tired, but his gentle eyes had not changed. George did not recognize her at first. Emily opened her violin case and showed him the faded note. When she read the words aloud, recognition crossed his face. He whispered her name as though remembering a song. Emily asked where he was going. George tried to avoid the question, but finally admitted he was losing his home. She remembered the advice he had given her 15 years earlier and told him that leaving a door open had become her promise. The next morning, Emily drove George to a vacant storefront in the center of Millbrook. Sunlight crossed restored wooden floors. New tools hung above polished benches, and shelves waited for instruments in need of patient hands. A sign above the entrance named it the George Miller Music Workshop. Emily's foundation had purchased the building. The ground floor would provide free repairs and lessons, while a comfortable apartment waited for George upstairs. George insisted he could not accept such a gift. Emily placed the key in his hand and explained that he was not accepting anything. He was continuing what he had begun on a rainy night when he saved a frightened child's future. Months later, children filled the workshop with uncertain scales and laughter. George taught them that damaged things were not useless, and Emily performed on the same restored violin. One quiet act of kindness had become a lifetime of second chances.